Jacob Dobson here in the sculpture studio today discussing 10 steps that I have organized to help with sculpting the human figure. We will begin today to discuss gesture line, but I want to just first talk about the setup before we get into gesture. First of all, it's important to have a rotating base for a small figure like this, an 18-inch figure, on a little Lazy Susan, that is positioned high enough that our eyes are relatively in the midsection. If our eyes are above the sculpture looking down, that can lead to problems with perspective distortion. It's important also to have some references for you to evaluate and to compare your work with to see where you're going. These references can ideally be, of course, a live model. Certainly nothing beats that because we're working from 3D to 3D. That is certainly the ideal. The second ideal, of course, is photography. Of course, we never work from our head. That is not something we do until we've earned that opportunity to see and have earned our merit badges, so to speak, on observation and being sophisticated with our observation. But using references is essential to our growth and development of understanding the human anatomy, the form, and all of its nuances when we talk about individuals. But when we don't have access to a live model due to a lack of funds, a lack of availability, we have to settle with reference photography. I recommend that reference photography is taking photographs at least 14 feet back distance, so we don't have camera distortion from the figure. Stand back at least 14 feet to take the reference photography, zoom in if necessary, and then to get that model from 8 different angles. And with 8 different angles, you can do pretty good in terms of identifying the form in every direction. Since photography is a challenge compared to working from a live model, it is important to, I believe, to really understand how camera distortion works and really understand your model. And one way that I've found to be helpful is to draw the figure in the pose that you've chosen. And by doing so, it helps you really understand the form in ways maybe the photographs have not been so generous. But there is one advantage to photographs that live models do not provide, and that's with action poses. Action poses are not easy for live models to hold due to either a lack of balance or just the physical toll of such a pose. One of the poses, so a walking pose such as this can be a challenge for a model to hold for either a long period of time, sufficient for a sculptor to use observation from. I've seen Norman Rockwell use some blocks underneath the feet in his reference photography to help with the feet resting, to get these heels up in the air. But I still feel like it looks contrived and it doesn't seem to have the kinetic energy that only the real thing could provide. So there are some pros and cons to photography. There's pros and cons to the live model. Certainly, I advocate always, if possible, when not using a kinetic pose, such as a walking cycle, to always use a live model if possible, and if you can afford it, or if you have someone so generous to be able to pose for you. This is the best for most individuals can only afford photography, so drawing from the figure is a helpful way to kind of compensate for the like I said, the disadvantages of photography and the lens distortion that happens there. Today, I want to talk about gesture in this first video. Gesture is an essential part to understanding the whole entire figure as a whole. It is the design of the figure. It's the composition. It is where we are going to be emoting the energy or emoting the emotion or expression or message that we're trying to convey. And how we do that? We do that specifically with the principles of design, of course, but specifically movement, rhythm, in this case also balance, working with proportion. So movement, rhythm, balance, and proportion work together to accomplish the gesture. The gesture is hard to describe. It's not something that can be done easily with just one word. It's a collaborative effort of these various principles to create what we know as the gesture. Gesture is something that takes practice to understand and to notice and to see the rhythm and to see the movement and the totality of it from head to toe. But it is in essence the goal of sculpture. Ultimately, it is the goal to express with this gesture, and it's interesting that it's also the first step when we look at the overall figure. So we have the clay here squeezed on. It's nice and firm. We grip it from every angle like this, not one angle like this. When we do that, we kind of are using the wire inside the leg or the limbs or the torso to slice the clay inside. We don't want to do that. We want to press from every angle to kind of really grip it around that wire. So we get the clay on there nice and tight, and we step back. We avoid looking at any one specific area. We look at it from every angle. Perhaps maybe the back has tilted a little bit. The beauty of aluminum wire is you can bend it around like a action figure. We see here the arms are back, almost like she's busting through. We have, of course, a long stride here going on with high energy. We want to look at the figure from straight on. How does it look from straight on versus the profile view and even the 3/4 views considered? When we have a little bit of an armature wire that's in the way, I recommend a hammer or even a smaller hammer to kind of bust that wire back into place. Hitting a sculpture with clay armature is very forgiving. The clay absorbs the shock and doesn't seem to damage the rest of it. But by doing that, it's a quick way to kind of make sure you've got the leg in the right place. With gesture, it's good to not do too many measurements. Let your intuition come in at this stage. Let your intuition, instinct come through. Let your feelings come into this thing and work from that approach. One of the things that helps at this stage is to really look at your model, feel the energy that's there, understand why it's interesting, understand why it's motivated you to sculpt such a position, and really just observe. Take time to do that. A lot of times we don't have that pause moment where we step and look, and that really gets in the way of us understanding the rest of the figure throughout the process. So really look at it to the point where you know it. And then something that's not talked about very much is loving it. Loving the figure, loving the principles of design that you're observing. Appreciate the rhythm, appreciate the movement and the balance and the proportions, all the things that collectively work together to create this beauty that you're trying to understand and then express. So, and then after that, after the observing, the looking, and after the knowing from the observing, and after the appreciation from the knowing, you go, and then that's when you go and touch the clay and work it and manipulate it into positions. So basically, to review that, that's to look, to know, and know to love, and love to go. So I found that it's important to follow that process. It's very common for amateur sculptors to just go and hopefully with the working of the clay and moving it around, that we will find the proportions we want, and we're thinking about those proportions almost right away and trying to find them with the clay helping us get there. Remember, the clay and working the clay does not get us anywhere. Our eyes do all that. Our eyes tell the hands, and then we find the form through that approach. So that's an important thing to really process. So look, know, love, and go. And to step back often and to observe the overall gesture, and don't get caught up in too many the small details. We want to work from large tools to small tools, like this large loop tool, this other tool here that I cut little teeth in so it acts like a rake and not a flat blade like this that acts more like a hoe in a garden. We want to go over the form like a rake in a garden and not like a hoe that gouges and bumps and as you kind of drag across. So again, rake tools of large scale is where we begin with this figure. Large tools force you to see large shapes. If you want to carve a large statue in a wood log of a figure, you wouldn't start with a little hand chisel. You'd start with a chainsaw, larger saws, and then medium tools, and then small tools last. That seems to make a lot of sense when we're talking about carving stone or wood, but sometimes gets missed when we're talking about sculpting clay, maybe because it's pretty forgiving. So these are some things to keep in mind for the gesture. It's something to practice. It's not something that's ever completely mastered by anyone. It's something that has challenged even the greatest of artists throughout their whole lives, and keeps them interested and keeps them going. And I find that tremendously exciting and inspiring, knowing that this is something that can always be better understood, that there's always more to discover. I hope this was helpful for our for our first step. Our next step, we will look at gesture as it relates to balance.